Welcome to another episode of the Caroline Glick Show. I'm Caroline Glick. We're about a week after Israel's elections. I'm recording on Monday, the 7th of November, and the elections were the 1st of the month. And yesterday, the 6th of November, we had the memorial for slain Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was murdered by a right-wing sociopath named Yigal Amir. In 1995, on November 4th, 1995, and the Jewish memorial according to the Jewish calendar, for his death was on the 6th of November this year. So they cited it with a memorial ceremony at the Knesset, and then by Rabin's grave at Mount Herzl Cemetery in Jerusalem. And I wanted to start my discussion today on the show with a discussion of what happened yesterday regarding Rabin's death, his assassination, and the memorializing of his legacy. Because I think that as we're moving towards the rapid formation of the incoming Netanyahu government, where he's got a coalition of a very homogenous ideologically coalition that includes the Likud and the more religious coalition members, the National Religious Party, and the two ultra-Orthodox parties, Shas and Agudat Yisrael, or United Torah Judaism. You're already seeing very clearly and very hysterically the demonization that this incoming government and its leaders and its members are undergoing at the hands of the defeated left in Israel, and also of their allies, particularly in the United States. And I wanted to talk about that in the framework of how the discussion of Rabin's assassination has been playing out in the Israeli media and in Israeli politics over the past 24 or so hours. Just to begin, a little bit of my own personal background. So many of you know, many of you don't know, that when I was in the military during the Oslo peace process years, and from 1994 until 1996, really at the height of the so-called peace process, the Oslo peace process with the PLO. I was a captain in the IDF, and I served as the coordinator for the negotiations on civil affairs with the Palestinians from the Office of the Coordinator of Government Activities in the territories, which is responsible for the civil administrations of the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria and in Gaza at the time. And we were the unit that had been administering the civil affairs of those areas, the government of those areas through the military government. So we were kind of the government, and we were transferring the powers of governance to the PLO through its Palestinian Authority. So we were involved with all the negotiations, and I was one of the core members of the Israeli negotiating team, drafting the agreements, negotiating them with the Palestinians for about 2 years. And I worked in that capacity, not directly, but certainly I had a lot of dealings with Yitzhak Rabin, and then with Shimon Peres, Rabin obviously before he was assassinated, as a young officer in the army. And so I knew his advisors, who he had posted in the negotiations with me quite well, and had an enormous amount of regard for them. So I wouldn't say that I'm an expert on Rabin, but I would say that I did experience his leadership firsthand as a young woman, as a young officer in the army. So I'm not speaking from complete ignorance or just from watching television at the time, which really wasn't reflective either then or in the intervening years of the Rabin that I experienced in, some very top level, where I was a fly on the wall, not a participant, discussions in his security cabinet, in his cabinet with the military during that time. And so I want to start the discussion with what happened in the Knesset, in the memorial ceremony. So the left has long claimed, since really before Rabin's assassination, that incoming and former Prime Minister Netanyahu was inciting for Rabin's murder. And this was a complete demonization of Netanyahu at the time and since, because Netanyahu very clearly spoke out against the incitement on the right against Rabin in the year or so before he was assassinated. From the beginning, the initiation of the Oslo peace process in September of 1993 through Rabin's assassination in November of 1995, Netanyahu was one of the chief defenders of Rabin and the legitimacy of his right to go forward with this policy, even though we all on the right, even I, who was in the army at the time, were deeply opposed to it, both from a security and strategic perspective, and also from a Zionist perspective. And we were our fears were all borne out in spades in the intervening years since, because it really has been such a disaster for Israel. At any rate, Rabin, the left was waving the bloody flag of Rabin's assassination, continues to do so to this day. And one of the principal victims of that bloody flag demonization policy of the left has been Benjamin Netanyahu, and really as a means to attack the entire and delegitimize and demonize the entire political right in Israel as bearing collective responsibility for Rabin's assassination. So one of the notable aspects of Rabin's legacy is his final speech before the Knesset in October of 1995, just weeks before he was murdered, where he set out his vision for what peace with the Palestinians would ultimately look like from the perspective of Israel, and what he was talking about when he was talking about autonomous governments for the Palestinians. He explained that the Palestinian political entity that he envisioned being formed at the end of the process was not going to be a state, not a full state at any rate. It would be a self-governing Palestinian Authority. Israel would have sole control over security in Judea and Samaria, of the airspace, of the borders into and out of Judea and Samaria, basically along the lines of what we've really had since 1996, when the Palestinian Authority assumed control over all Palestinian population centers in Judea and Samaria. They've been governing themselves since then. Over 95% of Palestinians have been living under Palestinian governance, under the Palestinian Authority, since 1996. At any rate, he explained that Israel would have full control over the Jordan Valley, which is the area that borders Jordan. So the Kingdom of Jordan is on the eastern bank of the River Jordan, and Judea and Samaria are on the west bank, and the Jordan Valley is the area that is the frontier zone that Israel requires in order to protect itself against foreign invasion from the eastern banks of the Jordan and also from Syria. So he explained that Israel would continue to have perpetual control and sovereignty over the Jordan Valley and also over the Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria. And that really, and his heir, the heir to that vision for what Israel's borders would look like, what a Palestinian political entity in Judea and Samaria would look like, is none other than Netanyahu. And that was reflected also in the Trump peace plan that was put together with Netanyahu, and Trump presented it in January of 2020. And under the Trump plan, Israel's sovereignty would be extended to all of the areas where there are Jewish communities, and to the Jordan Valley as a frontier zone, and really over first 30 and probably over time 50% of Judea and Samaria, and all of the areas that the Palestinians now govern would remain under Palestinian governance, and ostensible or limited sovereignty into the future. So that it would basically take the status quo and render it permanent, but also give certainty to it. It would be clear that this is what was going on, and end the question mark about how things are going to go, and that would really stabilize the situation, because everybody would understand what sort of reality we're living in, who's in charge of what, and how. Because what we've had in this intervening period is increasing questioning not only of the legitimacy of Israel's control, which Israel requires in Judea and Samaria to protect itself and to maintain its very existence, but also, Israel's legitimacy in general. So that the question about Israel's legitimacy in Judea and Samaria has bled into sovereign Israel, sovereign Israeli territory, Tel Aviv, Haifa, Beersheba, obviously Jerusalem, etc. So that the continued questioning about whether Israel is legitimate or not in its control over and sovereign rights to Judea and Samaria has really led to a question about whether Israel itself has a right to exist. So Netanyahu, in his speech, remembering Rabin, he talked about that speech and explained, that this is really the vision that Rabin laid out, because this was his vision for peace between Israel and the Palestinians, and that Netanyahu is in fact the heir to that vision. And you can agree with it or disagree with it, but from a factual perspective, Netanyahu is absolutely right. The vision that he put forward 2 years ago is the same vision, more or less, that Rabin put forward in that speech before he was assassinated in the Knesset in October of 1995. And on the other hand, outgoing Prime Minister Yair Lapid did what the left has really been doing all along for the past nearly 30 years, which is to demonize the right and distort Rabin's own legacy of what he believed and what he stood for, in order to transform Rabin, who was sort of a realist nationalist, into a John Lennon-esque utopian progressive. But then what was notable was that the head of the National Religious Party, Bezalel Smotrich, got up and said, while of course condemning Rabin's assassination, he said there are still a lot of open questions about how Israel's own internal security services were politicizing and inciting against the right and demonizing the right before Rabin's assassination. So, for instance, the main instigator, the main propagator of incendiary materials against Rabin in 1994 and 1995 portrayed him as a terrorist wearing a keffiyeh and called him a murderer, was a man named Avishai Raviv, who was actually, it worked out afterwards, an agent provocateur of Israel's security agency, the Shabak, so that he was actually getting a salary from the people who were charged with defending Rabin and fighting efforts by Jewish extremists to harm Rabin, not in the political sphere, but in the sphere of political violence. They were actually ginnying up public demonization of Rabin, and they were inventing it. They were instigating it through Avishai Raviv. They ignored reports of Yigal Amir that were already surfacing, that people were warning against him, that he was saying that he wanted to assassinate Rabin. I mean, these are all matters for public record. And they were demonizing opponents of the Oslo Accords. There was an effort by Channel 1, which was the main broadcast station in Israel at the time, state broadcasts. It's state run, it still is, where they invented out of whole cloth a terrorist organization called Eyal, where Avishai Raviv organized it at the behest of the Shabak. And they presented, it was all staged with actors essentially saying that they were Jewish terrorists from this organization called Eyal. And the State Department actually posted it as a foreign terrorist organization. And afterwards it worked out it was all a lie. It was a production, it was complete fake news to demonize the right and to say that right-wing opponents of the Oslo peace process were terrorists. And so Smotrich brought this up as well in his speech. And what was notable was that former heads of the Shabak were interviewed on the radio this morning and on television last night, and they attacked Smotrich for daring to besmirch the operations of the Israel Security Agency when what he was doing 28 years after the fact, or 27 years after Rabin was assassinated, was saying we have to have a discussion about what happened here, because, obviously the assassination was a disaster and was a heinous criminal act by Yigal Amir, but there's a lot to this story that we have to understand in order for us to understand both what happened to us at the time and to heal the rifts between Israeli society, heal the wounds that have polarized our society and divided us from one another because we don't understand the full truth of what the government's involvement in the demonization of Rabin was, and we deserve a full accounting of that. So the left didn't respond by saying, okay, let's open the books, let's talk about it. They opened their mouths instead and responded by saying that Smotrich himself is illegitimate, and the questions that he raised, which have been raised by millions and millions of Israelis since 1995, are completely illegitimate and must be silenced. So that was really notable because the idea here is that in order to justify continuing on with a policy, the two-state policy, the appeasement of the Palestinians policy, you have to ignore so many things that are part of discernible reality. And the way that you do that is by demonizing your political opponent, so that you're demonizing reality and anybody who dares to see it. You're saying, this is Rabin's legacy, when actually Rabin's legacy is what Netanyahu laid out in his speech. We're going to completely ignore it. We're going to change the subject. We're going to pretend, we're going to create a new Rabin who was a peace activist, anti-Western, progressive, cultural Marxist, just like we are. And we're going to say that anybody who denies this lie about who Rabin actually was is evil and illegitimate and a demon and demonic and a danger to democracy. We're going to do that, and this is what we're going to base the discourse on. And over time, especially as the body count rose from year to year because of the catastrophe that the Oslo peace process, that the fake peace with the PLO, that the failed an anti-Israel two-state paradigm that says that Israel is to blame for the absence of peace rather than Palestinian rejection, Arab rejection of Israel's right to exist and of the Jewish people's right to self-determination in our historic homeland, that's the reason why there is no peace. So all of this has to be cast aside, and the people who notice it, who say we have to base our policies on reality, have been demonized. And so that's where we are today as we move forward. And so I think that, or I know that so much of the demonization that the left is now undertaking against the incoming coalition, really, I don't know whether it had its roots. I think it predated Rabin and it predated Oslo. But it really is so vividly expressed. It was so vividly expressed in the debate yesterday in the Knesset, where the only person who was speaking about Rabin as he lived, as I personally saw him living and speaking and talking and explaining his policies, whether inside of government deliberatory sessions on the negotiations with the Palestinians or in the Knesset, they tried to create a new Rabin out of whole cloth, who is them, and then take this imaginary Rabin who didn't exist and use him as a means to silence opposition. But there's another aspect to that we've also seen over and then the right is left to question, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to put out a hand and say, look, we have things that divide us, but let's try to work together, which is what Netanyahu tried to do in his speech? Or are you supposed to say, look, I want explanations, you demonized me, and I want to show that what you were doing was untrue and a lie, and I want justice for the crimes that you've committed against my character and against my community, which is what Smotrich was saying. And that balance between the two is always difficult to find, because the left, for its part, is not interested in having a discussion about reality, as we saw, where all of these ostensibly responsible people on the left, I think that the answer here, when we're getting into the mix of what to do, is to really, follow a lead by Netanyahu and hew to his lead, which says, what, let's just follow reality. The reality is what it is. The demonization of the right preceded and Rabin's assassination. And aside from that, our views aren't that different. But let's just concentrate on what is true about Israel, what is true about uh, Zionism, what is true about our national rights, and I think that at the end of the day, um, we're going to see, hopefully, if the right forthrightly goes forward and implements its agenda that is justified, that makes sense, that is required by reality, then at the end of the day, we're going to see at least some people on the left being willing to say, okay, this is not wrong. This may be different from what I want, but I can't say that this is illegitimate. And let's try to go forward against the wishes of the radicals on the left, and meet them halfway. So I think you have to do both. You have to demand an explanation and an accounting, but you also have to do it on the basis of fact, on the basis of what happened, what has happened since, and also, but not do that in and of itself. Do it part and parcel of moving forward with an agenda that makes sense, that will protect and preserve your country and your nation. So those are my thoughts in the face of this kind of demonization that we've been undergoing. You know, when I was thinking about the question of demonization, it seemed to me that there's nobody better that I could talk about it with than my friend and colleague, Dan Diker. Dan of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs is really one of the deepest thinkers about demonization, where it stems from, and how to move forward in dealing with it in Israel today. So I'm really happy to have Dan Diker here with me on the show to discuss it. And so without further ado, I want to move over to my discussion with Dan. Well, I'm pleased to be joined now by my friend and colleague, Dan Diker from the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Dan is an expert on political warfare, psychological warfare. And as I was saying, one of the main themes that we see going back, all the way to the dawn of modern Zionism, really, is how the left here in Israel and also abroad increasingly, and we're going to talk about that, uses demonization of the right as a tool for political power, and also to hamstring the right when it comes into power. And what we're seeing very clearly today is that the Israeli right is being demonized. Netanyahu, his incoming coalition partners, are being demonized in a very fundamental way by the Israeli left and by the American left. So let me just open it up to you, Dan. Um, First of all, we're seeing in Israel that for several weeks now, the over the towards the last month of the campaign, Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz and their party members have been attacking Ben Gvir, Itamar Ben Gvir, the head of the Otzma Yehudit, the Jewish party, power party that's part of the religious Zionism party coalition, as fascist, as pro-terrorist, and they really tried to undermine the Likud during the campaign by making this all about Ben Gvir and then siphoning off votes from the Likud to Ben Gvir as well. But um, it spread largely because of their efforts, but it spread to the United States, to the U.S. Jewish community, to Democratic Israel supporters like Senator Robert Menendez and others. Can you just give me your sense of what we are, how you look at this, how you look at the demonization and the delegitimization?
Caroline, sure. First, let me tell you what a pleasure it is to join the Caroline Glick Show, where we always talk about, we get right to the bottom line on these issues without beating around the bush. And it's always a pleasure to be able to do that, because these issues are very, very serious. The issues that we're discussing today, which is the, I would call it the Israel rootedness of Israel's international demonization. Let me just begin by quickly answering your first question, and that is, if we've ever seen in Israel a perfect political storm that basically created a reverse tidal wave against the left strategy. which was to demonize the Israeli right by what they thought going after low-lying fruit, which is Itamar Ben-Gvir, a former acolyte of Rabbi Kahana, who since has changed, has moderated, if you will, his political positions and has positioned himself as the new sheriff in town, the new crime buster, terror buster. This is a man who the left went after as being, the same, what they call the same so-called racist that he was many decades ago. But it completely backfired on the left. If you look at the numbers, the Ben-Gvir Smotrich faction won 14 seats, which was they were polling at 11 for the last 6-7 months. So it was a complete reaction. Their success was a reaction against the left. And if we look at the numbers of the left, it just proves the point. On the eve of in 1992, on the eve of what was known as the historic Oslo peace accords, beginning with the exchange of letters and then the Oslo interim agreement in 1995. In 1992 elections, when Rabin won the elections in opposite Shamir, the Labour Party won 44 seats out of 120 seats in our parliament, and the Meretz Party won what they call a record-breaking 12 seats in the parliament. So between the two of them, they had 56 seats. Right today, the Labour Party barely passed the minimum threshold with 4 seats, which was a record for them on the low side. And for the first time since 1992, the Meretz Party, the Israel's progressive party or progressive left party, actually did not even get into the Knesset. So it was a complete wipeout for their strategy and their electoral fortunes. Now the question is, what has happened here in the attempt of the Israeli left to demonize the Israeli right in order to gain power? It is actually inflamed, intensified in anti-Semitism around the West and among Jews living in the West, as well as among Jews living in Israel. So it's had an anti-Semitism boomerang effect, moving the left out of power and years away from power in Israel, but even more dangerously, resulting in a bloody demonization effect against the Jewish state throughout the diaspora, because all the liberal progressive community needs to do is to see the left in Israel, whom they think are their counterparts, and in a minute we'll understand why they're not, delegitimize the right, and that gives all of the mainstream media and social networks a good excuse to demonize Israel as well. It's a very dangerous state of affairs that we are seeing at the moment on the international scene.
It's interesting because you were saying that it's anti-Semitic. Can you just, I understand what you mean, but it would be good, I think, to just sort of flesh it out a little bit, because when you say it's because I think that inherently, and we see it very clearly this week, we had, the guy, the so-called philosopher on the political left, Professor Asa Kasher, who wrote the ethical code of the IDF and also of Israeli academic institutions, wrote a post on his Facebook page where he referred to Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and the ultra-Orthodox Jews of Israel as a mutation, as parasites, as an unacceptable form of Judaism, and he referred to himself as somebody who comes from with Jewish roots, but he didn't refer to himself at all as Jewish. And so there was it was so obviously anti-Semitic what he said, and it's very strange, for Jews abroad to understand the instrumental use that the left makes, and also the ideological views that the left in Israel have, that bear so much, that have very strong, unmistakable anti-Semitic characteristics inside of them, and that their use of them for political gain in Israel has this infectious effect it serves as a contaminant for the discourse against Jews around the world. Because if Asa Kasher is saying this about Netanyahu's coalition partners and Netanyahu himself, then why shouldn't white supremacists or progressive anti-Semites in the United States or Jewish progressives use this as well as they join the anti-Semitic demonization of the Jewish state campaign?
You know, it's very compelling that in your question, very, very eloquently laid out, Carolyn, you've actually supplied the answer. And this is, we need to parse out what Professor Asher Kasher meant when he used very tough language in describing Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, because what he meant is
and also Shas and also Agudat Yisrael. I mean, he went after all of them
exactly.
in turn.
He went after all of them because his frame of reference is his life here as a Jew from a sociological, religious standpoint, a domestic, sociological, religious standpoint as a Jewish Israeli living in the nation state of the Jewish people. He, Professor Kasher, who, as you very rightly pointed out, wrote the IDF ethical code, has actually been a major critic of the way people on the outside of Israel have instrumentalized Israel as anti-Zionist, to being anti-Zionist, but not connecting that to anti-Semitism. He, Asher Kasher, actually in an article that he wrote in my book called Israelophobia and the West, very correctly laid out the connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and he bridged the two. So on the one hand, he's giving us an important pathway to understand the demonization tendency in the West, which is to separate out what they understand to be anti-Semitism, which is either violence or rhetorical violence against individual Jews, traditionally coming from the political extreme right, as opposed to the new anti-Semitism, as Professor Kasher calls it, which is largely coming from the left and beating, demolishing, annihilating, defaming, and delegitimizing the collective Jewish community, which is the state of Israel. So on the one hand, Professor Asher Kasher is very much a proponent of the fusion between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. But on the other hand, as you point out, within the Israeli domestic context, he's come out against Ben-Gvir and Smotrich as a, let's call it perhaps a non-Orthodox observant Jew, looking at them from that point of view as being racist or extremist. The language in Israel becomes very, very irresponsible. The domestic discourse in the state of Israel is very, the adage, loose lips sink ships. There's a very violent, if I might say, rhetorically violent discourse in Israel between left and right, with all kinds of language being hurled back and forth with completely inappropriate terms like fascist and even worse than fascist being hurled within the domestic discourse. So the point we're trying to make here is that Professor Asher Kasher does not mean what demonizers in the outside of Israel mean when he lambasts Ben-Gvir and Smotrich as being extremist, as being racist. He's talking as a, let's say, a liberal Jew living within Israel, looking at them in some way as threatening his position as a non-Orthodox observing Jew, when in fact, on the issue of anti-Zionism being fused with anti-Semitism, he very rightly points out the mistakes that his, let's say, non-Orthodox or even adversaries attempt to distinguish between anti-Zionism, which they say in America and in Europe is strictly political criticism, whereas anti-Semitism is traditionally a violence against individual Jews. Professor Kasher rejects that differentiation in America, but on the other hand, as you point out, in the domestic scene, he sends really a confusing message to the diaspora because he sort of aligns with them in terms of nomenclature, but he means something very different than what they mean when they call Israel, when they call Ben-Gvir and his counterparts, what they call racist or fascist or all this language, this extremist language that bears no reality, no relation to actual reality on the ground.
I'm going to have to disagree with you there, Dan, for a couple of reasons. One is because he's not stupid. And when he uses terms like parasites and mutations in a Facebook page, on his Facebook page, albeit in Hebrew, demonizing, uh, um, dehumanizing his political opponents. He is engaging in anti-Semitism, and more than that. And I saw him on a subsequent television interview on Channel 11 where he was trying to, um, you know, uh, um, justify what he wrote. And he said, well, when I said mutation, what I really just meant was that, there's a generational difference and every generation is different from its predecessors. But that's, utter garbage. And anybody of his academic rank, should absolutely understand the implications of using the term in a diatribe. But beyond that, we've really seen and I think we're going to see it much more. And this is what's most worrisome to me is that over the past many years, and particularly since the Likud formed a government without the left in 2015, Netanyahu formed a government in 2015 without a left-wing party for the first time, that the left recognized or decided that the way to force, after they lost at the polls in 2015 and did so even more profoundly last week, they decided that the way to get their way, to force their policies on a people that had already determined and made clear at the polling booths that they were unwilling to be led by these progressive post-nationalist, post-Zionists, who engage in and cultivate anti-Semitism in the discourse, um, is to go abroad. So, for instance, we have the Tom Friedman article in the New York Times that came out a couple of days ago, where he says that Israel that he loved, or I don't know exactly when he ever loved Israel, but he pretends he did, Israel that he loved is no more, and that now we've become this ultra nationalist, extremist, religious ethno state that he compared to, a second Trump term of office with all of the left's bête noirs in the cabinet and in positions of power, and how terrible this is, and how difficult it was going to be for American Jews to support this new horrible Israel now. And his primary source for making these contentions was Yediot Achronot, post-Zionist, very radical lead commentator for many years, Nahum Barnea, who has been a chief propagandist against the Israeli right for at least a generation and a half. So he talked to him, and he talked to the very far left professor Moshe Halbertal from Hebrew University as well, so that his sources for demonizing Israel were Asa Kasher's colleagues and friends on the intellectual left. So I disagree that Asa Kasher was behaving in a provincial manner, and he didn't really think about the larger implications. And because his group, his clique, is engaged, is using its ties to liberal Jews abroad to demonize the country.
Well, first of all, I want to let me just correct what I intended to say. Maybe I didn't convey it properly. There's no excuse for him to use that type of language, and that's what I meant when I said that there are, these loose lips and this type of, in a domestic context, demonizing language. There's no excuse for that. The only thing I was trying to do is to point out that his context was domestic, and that in the international context, he actually would agree with the thrust of this conversation. But what the paradox is, Caroline, to bridge what you're saying with what I was trying to say, is that he serves as a bridge for the demonizers in the diaspora, primarily today in North America, even more than Europe, to engage in this wholesale defamation, delegitimization, desecration, and the dehumanization of Israel, and that that connection is lost. I even think it's lost on Professor Kasher, and it's lost on a number of his colleagues here. To deepen the context of what you're discussing regarding Professor Halbertal, Tom Friedman back in the mid and late 1980s and early 1990s was an acolyte of Professor David Hartman, who was the former father-in-law of Professor Halbertal. Professor Halbertal was the head of the Hartman Institute, which was a very, very dovish, even far, and today really on the far left in Israel's discussion, institute that basically adopted Tom Friedman and allowed him to sort of imagine what Israel could be, if there was a John Lennon type of we have no borders in Middle East. And so therefore the Middle East for Tom Friedman is one of the imagination of not one in reality in which the level of terrorism against civilians here has actually picked up fivefold since the Oslo Peace Accords was signed. And what is missing is a profound or even a superficial understanding that Israel took a nearly suicidal chance for the cause of peace. And what ended up happening is that this peace process ended up decimating the so-called peace camp in Israel. And that's the ultimate proof as to the level of cognizance and sort of new consciousness that the Israeli public, which generally socially is a very liberal public. By the way, the probable incoming foreign minister, according to reports yesterday, may be Amir Ohana, who is a demonstrably LGBT member of that community and a Sephardi Jew. So, and this is the so-called illiberal Netanyahu, who is going to, according to reports yesterday, appoint Ohana to the former public security minister to one of the senior portfolios, and may well be the foreign minister. So what has happened in the West is this very regretful engagement, deep engagement in what we understand to be anti-Semitism, and what the IHRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, which just about every single state in the Union of the United States of America has adopted as official policy, in addition to the EU 27. So this is where the West disconnects with Israel, is that the West disconnects the idea that you can call Israel, God forbid, a Nazi or an apartheid state or a genocidal state or a racist entity, and you really believe in the West that you can hide behind that nomenclature, calling it legitimate political criticism, when in fact anyone who engages in that type of nomenclature, in that discourse, whether he or she is a Jew or whether he or she is a Gentile, is pure, unadulterated Jew hatred and anti-Semitism. That is a disconnect between the discourse in Israel, even on the left or left center, and the left in the outside of Israel.
I think that one of the problems that we're facing here is really that there's a disconnect mainly between. I think it's twofold, and you see it in the United States as well. We're recording this on Monday, the day before the United States' midterm elections, that you see a disconnect on two levels. One is that the left is simply here in Israel and also in the United States is fundamentally disconnected from reality, so that the demonization and oftentimes deliberately disconnected from reality. So like you were talking about Amir Ohana, who may well be our next foreign minister. He's certainly one of the leading contenders for the position. He is married to a man, and they're raising their children together in Tel Aviv, and he's also politically conservative and very traditionally, or certainly respectful, if not observant of traditional Judaism. And so he's sort of along the lines for Americans of Rick Grinnell, of Trump's director of national intelligence and ambassador to Germany. And they're actually friends, but it's the idea that all members of the LGB community must have radical progressive political perspectives. So that's ignoring and to a large degree dehumanizing members of that community, which is something that the left does. And so they ignore the actual ideas, actions, values, ideology that animates their political opponents, because they want to demonize them to make everybody fear them and to instill a fear and a detestation of anybody who's not on the progressive side of the aisle, in the hearts and minds of the people whose votes they're trying to get. And the other problem that you see is that their policies themselves are hateful in the eyes of the vast majority of the people in their country. We saw this very clearly in a lot of the anti-Jewish policies that the outgoing government tried to implement, from blocking for enabling non-kosher Passover food into hospitals, which blocks Jews who keep kosher for Passover to abide by the religious strictures of the holiday, whether they're patients or medical staff or visitors in the hospital. So, or that, or trying to have public transportation on Shabbat with the trains, which goes against Israel's status quo and the way that things are done in this Jewish state, and all the way to our national security policies, and basically giving control over our national interests to the Biden administration and everything in relation to Lebanon and Iran and the Palestinians. So they can't accept the legitimacy of people, either a people or positions that are opposed to their positions. And the use of anti-Semitism in this case is instrumental, because this is a Jewish state, and so they therefore engage in anti-Semitism to demonize their side, just as in the United States you have progressives who demonize American patriotism. And so it's very, very, very similar phenomenon, and it stems, I think, from the same cultural Marxist worldview.
Very much so, Caroline. I think that's the key point that you just put your finger on. This is a Marxist-Leninist worldview that, in the Middle East context, can be traced all the way back, clearly in the diplomatic discourse, to the 1960s, when the Soviet Union, which actually created, according to Pachepa, according to the Matrokin papers, and Ion Pachepa, who was the former Romanian head of intelligence when Soviet Union was the father saint, if you will, of the Romania as well as the rest of Eastern Europe. They basically, together with the PLO, created this sense of demonization of Israel under the watchwords called historical justice and peace and fellowship among men. And it is exactly this type of phenomenon which we see today, that's called intersectionality, that's called peace. The BDS movement calls itself the movement for peace, equality, and justice. All of this language was taken from the former Soviet Union, used by the PLO, which based its historic UN General Assembly Resolution 3379, Zionism is racism. That's exactly what we're saying today in the U.S. discourse, which has now morphed into much more violent nomenclature against both individual Jews and the collective Jewish state, and the collective Jewish community in the Jewish state. So this is very much part of that discourse. Mark Levin wrote a book about it called it was a culture of Mark Levin's book about Marxism, modern Marxism.
American Marxism.
And then another one. We have another one written by Lindsay called Race Marxism. So we're really, I think that is the reality that we find ourselves in. Israel is really right front and center on the target list, being referred to as a white supremacist country, and Jews in America being sort of outed as white supremacists.
Can you go back to what you were saying about how what we're seeing here is so much a function of what happened in terms of Soviet KGB operations into subversion operations inside of the Europe and the United States and Israel to try to undermine them and to undermine Western civilization, really.
Tara, I think one of the historical points that's been lost on this entire discussion and phenomenon in the West of the demonization of Israel really can be traced back to the 1960s. The Soviet Union in 1964-65 tried to have Israel painted as a Nazi state in the UN, and it failed. But then again, 10 years later, it actually was the sponsor and the drafter of the infamous UN General Assembly Resolution 3379, which is many of our viewers remember, which was the infamous Zionism is racism resolution that was passed and stood for 16 years in the United Nations, which basically cast the underlying idea of Jewish self-determination as a racist, illegitimate concept. And that, of course, was shelved. It wasn't rescinded per se. It wasn't annulled, but it was shelved in 1991 following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But this was this type of demonization of Israel as the source of international political trouble and lack of justice and ethno, as you called it, sort of ethnocentricity, a racist country is exactly what the Soviet Union and the PLO were promoting from the 1960s, 1970s. That's where we are today. People just don't trace it properly back to these Marxist Leninist ideas, but that's exactly where they are. And you pointed out very well, just to finish up the sentence, you pointed out very well, which is today's demonization in Israel, even against an LGBT member as a potential foreign minister of Israel who is a brown. He's not a white person, but he's a brown Israeli from the Middle East. He will be outed and demonized for his ideas, as you say very well, and not for who he is, which is a proof text of the Stalinist, completely illiberal positions of the far left today in America, who are demonizing Israel for being illiberal, and it's they who are being profoundly illiberal in their erasure, if you will, of no matter who comes from Israel, regardless of what minority that person is a part of.
Well, when we're looking at this now, I think the main, there's always a lot of stuff people talk about that's sort of extraneous to governing, as we're kind of in what I think Ron Dermer might call the sausage factory mode of trying to put together a coalition of coalition partners, of coalition politics. So we're sort of in the twilight moments of the outgoing government. Netanyahu wants to form his government as early as next week, if possible, when, immediately after he receives the mandate to do so from President Herzog. The minute that he gets it, he basically wants to come and say, okay, I got the mandate to form a government, here's my government, and then swear it in, if not that very day on November 16th, then, the day or a day or two afterwards, just to get everybody out of office. But and to get everybody into office. But in the meantime, you have a lot of things going on. And the main argument that we're hearing right now among members of the incoming coalition is how to respond to the demonization. So on the one hand, you had Itamar Ben-Gvir today writing a very apologetic, in a way, article in Israel Hayom, explaining that that his past expressed hatreds of the left and of Arabs, supporters of terrorism and terrorists, were a function of of his youthfulness. And he's grown up. He's now 46 years old, and he's mellowed, and he understands that the world isn't as simple as it seems in the eyes of a teenager. It's not all black and white, and that people have to give him the credibility of an adult to know how to behave responsibly. And then he's getting, and we saw this also, as I was talking about in my opening, in the arguments about Yitzhak Rabin and what the role of the state was in not protecting him and of demonizing the right in the months ahead of his murder. You have questions. Should we be apologizing? Should we not be apologizing? Should we be trying to justify our existence, and how how we behave to the left, or should we ignore them? Because just as there are far right people on the far extremists of the right on the political spectrum, so in the outgoing government we have members of Knesset and members of the government who are avowedly anti-Zionist, who are pro-terrorist, who have engaged, like outgoing Meretz MK Gabi Lasky, in defending terrorists in jails and in courts of law, and in demonizing Israel as a far left political actor for the decades that preceded her Knesset career, and yet she is not called upon to legitimize who she is. So this is sort of the argument. The question is, should we be trying to develop some sort of a more respectful discourse, or should we just be rejecting the need to apologize and go forward? And what would be your advice to Israeli uh, right wingers, to Zionists, in being attacked by this kind of wave of demonization going forward? How hospitable should they be to the notion that they have to explain themselves, to defend themselves? And what do you think should be their view going forward?
Well, certainly no community in Israel has a monopoly on justice and truth. I do think there are definitions and categories and parameters for civil discussion, it's very regretful when you hear this morning the media commentary and the guests like former Shabak head Yaakov Perry, skewering the comments of former Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who dared to ask a question about the many unanswered questions regarding the horrific assassination of our former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Many people have asked questions, factual questions, that have been unanswered by the Kahan Commission, questions that still remain. And he dared ask those questions. And the response to those questions, I think, and very regrettably, were a wholesale demonization of the one who asked the question. And I think that those on the political right in Israel need not apologize whatsoever, but should really reestablish, Dermer calls it moral clarity, as they see it in the discussion, and they should take these accusations head on, and they should even return accusations. Just as two examples, it was discussed in Rabin Square on the just in the months preceding Prime Minister Rabin's murder. There were all kinds of pictures like Rabin in a keffiyeh. Well, it's come out in official records that those photographs were actually fronted by the Shabak itself, by Avishai Raviv, who was a Shabak operative. And that fact gets lost in the discussion when it is far more popular to skewer the entire right of center community in the context of the horrific Rabin assassination. The second point here is, I remember personally that the former head of the Israel Broadcasting Association apologizing at the Ariel University David Bar-Ilan annual media conference when a former activist David Bedin asked him directly in front, and it's on record, as to whether the Israel Broadcast Association's supposed revelation of a far right-wing group that they accused of conspiring to drum up all kinds of incitement against the left was actually a construction, and it was a pure deceit. And that's a matter of public record. Now, if you were to say that in the public discussion in Israel, you would get skewered as being a right-wing extremist and a right-wing, racist, when these are all matters of public record. My point in raising these two specific examples is that the left in Israel has much to contribute to a fair, civic discussion about, liberal values, that many people on the right subscribe to liberal values, but it doesn't mean they have a monopoly on truth. It certainly doesn't mean that they have the right to demonize people that think differently than they do. And I agree with you that it is an issue of moral clarity for people on the right to take head on these types of demonization or accusations that really have no point in the Israeli discussion.
Yeah, I think that, the problem is that when you have one side demonizing the other side, you're not really having a discourse. Um, you're
You're having a
having
monologue.
well, it's not just a monologue. It's a blood sport. You can't actually. It's about destruction. It's not about
Construction.
cooperation.
Right.
And it's not about working together to build a better country or to advance your national interests. You have one side that effectively wants to just demolish the other side, and the side that's being victimized is trying to figure out how to deal with the people who have been aggressing against it. And some people think that we should act in a collaborative way and try to cooperate where possible. And some people say there's no point. And I personally go back and forth on the issue.
Well, I think
Because
there's one point, Carol, that we do have to mention. That is, and this is one of the things that I'm sort of pulling together as a strategy at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs as the incoming president, following Ambassador Dory Gold's imminent retirement, and that is that there are many Israeli Arab men and women, Druze, Israeli Arabs, Christians, and yes, Muslims, who very much see their political ideology on the more politically conservative side. And it's really a question of outreach. It's a question of being culturally intelligent. We have the same thing in Africa. I've just returned from Ethiopia, where we have, there are 120 million Ethiopians, and the Ethiopian government is very much on the side of Israel, wanting to understand how to fight terror, how to secure its own federal democratic republic. There are many other countries in Israel. Some of them are not democratic. However, there are many people that are deeply sympathetic to Israel. Even in America, there are many millions of Black Americans who are with Israel, and others such as Richie Torres, who is in Israel today as we have this discussion, who is part of the LGBT community and a very big supporter of Israel. My point being that there are many people in minority communities in Israel, in the Middle East, in our Abraham Accord partners, and in Africa and in the United States that are very much with the more politically conservative community in Israel. And I think it's high time to partner with these people, these men and women of good of faith and of goodwill, and not sort of leave the impression that if you're on the right, you are an Ashkenazi white Israeli woman or man. But in fact, we have the Rainbow Coalition very much together with us, no less and perhaps even more than in other political communities. And I think it's an important point to enlarge the strategic aperture of our partnerships in having this larger discussion about the direction that the nation-state Jewish people is pursuing.
I couldn't agree more. And congratulations, by the way, on your appointment. I should probably have said that at the outset, but I think that it's very important. I think, put it this way, I think that in if I can have the last word,
Please.
in the discourse about how the right should relate to the demonization of the left, that the answer is to probably ignore it as much as possible and just hew to reality. Just keep faith with what actually is, with how people actually behave, with the values that they actually uphold, and the interests that they're trying to advance and secure, rather than trying to answer people who you can't answer because, just as Asa Kasher, demonization is not something that you can respond to. No, I'm not a mutant. Let me prove to you that I have 10 fingers and 10 toes. I mean, it's not an accusation that there's any valid response to, because it's not a valid accusation. So instead of trying to figure out, whether you do in fact have a right to speak or don't have a right to speak because somebody tells you that you're illegitimate, the best thing to do is just to ignore the people who are trying to silence you, and to go forward with the facts as you understand them, and with the people who are with you, because they also are basing their positions, their support for you, their friendship towards you, their camaraderie, their willingness to work with you on reality, on facts, on their interests as they see them, on their values as they define them. So I think that that's really, whether it's Ricky Torres, whether it's Ted Cruz, whether it's, anybody, anybody at all who recognizes the validity of and the righteousness of Western civilization and of Judeo-Christian traditions in the West and of the Jewish tradition in Israel, I think that all of them have a lot to do and a lot of cooperation to enjoy, whether they're Israelis here at home or our friends abroad with the state of Israel and with this incoming government. So, Dan, I want to thank you very much for joining me in this discussion. As we go forward, we're going to get a lot more of this kind of demonization that we're already experiencing in a pretty profound way now, just less than a week after the elections, and so we'll definitely have a lot more to talk about this issue with you and other issues. So thanks so much for joining me today on the Caroline Glick Show, and I'll have you back soon.
Thank you so much, Caroline. It's always a pleasure, and it's it's always thought provoking, and I thoroughly enjoy myself in these discussions. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much for joining me today, Dan, and thank you all. And I hope you guys found it as enjoyable as Dan and I always do when we are able to get together and talk. So we'll see you again next week.